Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. My name is Meredith Gershenson, and I am joined today by Laura Timbrook. She is back on to talk a little bit about how to support the mental health of hourly staff. Laura, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back on.
Of course, of course. So, Laura is a national board certified health and wellness coach, international speaker who works with manufacturing and other shift working industries. She works with individuals and organizations to create a plan that fits their health and wellness goals while supporting their unique lifestyles. Awesome. So, to give everybody a quick run through on our Big Marker webinar platform here, if you haven't joined us in the past, we have the chat box to the right. Feel free to drop in where you're dialing in from. I'd love to hear from you all. Personally, I am from Chicago, but I'm actually visiting some family in Florida, so I'm coming in from Florida currently. I'd love to hear from everybody. While we're waiting on that, another little tool that we'll be using is the Q&A. We will be having a formal Q&A section, so be sure to throw in those questions throughout the webinar itself, and we'll be sure to go over them during a formal Q&A at the very end with Laura. And then we do have some poll questions throughout the webinar itself. Those will just be popping right up on the bottom left of your screen. So be sure to be looking out for those. They're just a really great way for us to interact with you guys, get a gauge of where everyone's heads are at. And finally, we do have an audit at the very end. It'll just help measure your organization's mental health protocols that are already in place. We are offering a $100 Amazon gift card to a lucky winner. I know the holidays are coming up, so that's going to be hopefully very beneficial for a lot of you. And then finally, we do have a SHRM PDC. So if you're a member of SHRM, I will share the PDC ID at the very end of the webinar. So be sure to stick around for that. And to give a little background on workforce.com, we are a workforce management software company who specializes in scheduling and time and attendance. And really, our overarching goal is to help business leaders and frontline managers make the best decisions for their company. Cool. Awesome. This is great to see everybody coming in. Thank you guys. Wow. Seattle, I love it. Jennifer coming in from Dallas, Texas. That's great. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for coming. Awesome. I hope everyone had a really great holiday. So to kick off, Laura, I'd love to for you to tell us a little bit about your background in the mental health and the workforce management space.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like Meredith said, I'm a board certified health coach. And, I work mainly in the corporate realm. And I focus mainly, and it's funny because everyone's always like, well, you work in corporate, but you focus on shift workers. Well,
Mhm.
a lot of times we have shift workers within the corporate industries and we leave them out a lot of times. So my goal is to come in and say, hey, we got to look at this. And I've been doing the same thing with some hourly waged employees, letting them know, okay, great. I'm glad your corporate wellness program's going really good.
Right.
What about the frontline employees? What about your boots on the ground? How are we supporting them? And that's really where I'm coming from, and working in corporate for so long, e- burnout, stress management are always huge topics. And now, mental health and wellness is really starting to play a realm in it. We see it with the whole quiet quitting. Trend growing and things like that. And it's really coming down to where we are in our mental health. So, my job as a board certified health coach is to focus on mental health as, within stress management and burnout, not necessarily the therapist end. But we're going to talk about how to kind of
Mhm.
refer that out because I think, some of you on this call kind of feel like you get stuck in this therapist space. And we're
Yep.
going to talk about how we can build those boundaries as well.
Yeah, there's a ton of different directions that this conversation can go. We did our best to really narrow down the scope. And yeah, I think it's going to be an amazing conversation. Laura, I'd love to hear a little bit about, the kind of certifications that you hold, and some of the training that you have there.
Yeah. So one of the newest certifications I actually just went through is the QRP Gatekeeper certification. And that's really to help suicide awareness and prevention. Because a lot of times I've been seeing last year has been really difficult.
Yep.
I've had multiple organizations have suicide within their organizations. I personally had two friends this past year that died by suicide. So it became really eye opening to me that a lot of times friends can come to you, coworkers can come to you, but do you always know how to handle it beyond that? And so that gatekeeper certification was able to give me, some tools on how to question, how to persuade them to seek help and where to refer them out. That's always the most
Mhm.
difficult part is where to send somebody for help, because not all the time do we know.
Right. That's a very good point. I would love for you to tell me a little bit about Shift HC and some of the work, that you do there.
Yeah, so Shift HC really stands for Shift Health Coach.
Mhm.
And it's really about, I found when I started working with a lot of my shift workers that, their career and their lifestyle, the career really dictated how their lifestyle was. So as we were talking about these healthy lifestyle changes, there became this stopping point where their career kind of dictated their meal times,
Mm,
how, their sleep cycle was going to go. It ran their circadian rhythm. Even when you're talking about just, a lot of times you're used to working with people that work Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. Now you're working with somebody that might work, anywhere from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. at night, Monday through Sunday.
right.
And every week's a little bit different. So it was really about designing something that fits their lifestyle, that they can easily implement without, having to question if they want to change their career, because so many people I work with, they absolutely love their career. They just didn't think healthy worked for them. And
Yeah.
it's really about raising that awareness and then bringing in the employers to realize, hey, listen, your smoking cessations might not be working those sessions because it's not designed specifically for them and their lifestyle.
Mm. That's really interesting. I would love, we kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on how much mental health and mental health awareness has skyrocketed over the past year, couple years or so.
Yeah, I think it's really been one of those things that's been building. I
Mhm.
think, 2020 really kind of brought it, to the surface.
Yep.
We couldn't ignore it anymore. It was so in our face and so prevalent,
Oh,
especially
right.
that people, for a lot of us, like someone like me, I had my family all home with me. I thought it was a great time.
Right.
Uh, wasn't so good for my business, but for my family life, it was great. But I had friends that didn't have spouses or partners or children, and they
Mhm.
were isolated for almost 18 months, some of them. And that's where we're really starting to see that. So I think it's been something that's been building, and this just brought it to the surface.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm seeing some of these responses coming in for this poll question I just sent out. I asked on a scale of 1 being a non-issue and 10 being a big issue, how much has mental health been an issue at your company? And a lot of people, majority are saying around that 7 mark. It's kind of up there. It
Mm.
might be even crawling closer to that 9 or even 10 mark. There's some people that are right in the middle, that are right at that 5. Does that kind of reflect on, what you've been seeing in some of the industries and companies that you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, we've been seeing a lot when it comes to burnout,
Mm,
specifically when we're talking about, the hourly wage employees, the shift working employees. Back in 2020, it was interesting. Well, 2021, really, when we started really putting in this hybrid workforce. However, if you're a shift worker or maybe you work in retail, there is no hybrid workforce. You have to go into the office.
right.
So I saw a lot of, a lot of my clients, they were feeling like, hey, you know, the corporate end gets all these benefits. What about us?
Yep.
And it started really causing a very big divide, even within a lot of manufacturing, a big divide between the frontline workers and the corporate folks, where it was very apparent which side you were on.
Mhm. Yeah, no doubt. And Tina actually threw out a comment in the chat. She said, "I think there are probably others that we don't know are have mental health issues, i.e., burnout, who just quit." And I
Hmm.
think that's a great point, and that's exactly what you're touching on. Where we were talking a little bit about this yesterday, Laura, and we were saying how in the corporate world in a salaried job, it's really easy to reap the benefits in a lot of the ways of hybrid work models, remote work where a lot of the hourly wage employees, the gig economy, that sort of thing, it's hard for them to necessarily take that into account because that's not what they're seeing. That's not their reality at the end of the day.
Yeah. And, we had a lot of people that really kind of weighed the benefits. If
Mhm.
they were working a job and maybe they didn't have to, but they enjoyed the job, then
Right.
it became, what? Do I really need that? We've seen people downsize their houses and their lifestyles because it was just like, what? It's not worth it anymore.
Definitely.
So, we've had some of that happening too. We've seen so many people that are just at retirement age, and it's like, I was going to hang in another 3 to 5 years, but I'm out now.
Mm. Oh my gosh, definitely. We see, Sherry, I see that you asked a question in the chat. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to tag it and we will definitely come to that during the Q&A section. So thank you so much. For those that have questions, throw them in the chat. We will get around to them. I want to point to this first slide that we have here, talking a little bit about what we've talked about in the end of 2021. We are seeing a lot of that anxiety, stress, burnout, and depression, those 4 factors right there. And now we're seeing a fewer, sense of each of them, but they're still pretty high, relatively speaking, for 2022. But we're seeing this comparison between 2020 and 2021. Laura, I'd love to hear, kind of what you think on how much COVID is to blame between these 2 pivotal years.
I think it has some to do with it. I think the bigger thing is that in 2020, we were very much in the mindset of helping. I'll
Mm,
do whatever I can. Everybody wanted to give extra to help.
right.
And I think it was a great time to see people really kind of in some ways come together for that. We saw it with manufacturing where they stopped their plants to make PPE. And there was one team in Pennsylvania that they actually locked employees in, and they volunteered. These employees volunteered for 60 days to be locked in their manufacturing facility to make PPE for local hospitals. So we had so many people giving so much. Then
Right.
2021 came, and there was no release. It was just, we need you to keep giving more, keep giving more. And now, to Diane's point here that
Mhm.
she's saying, now we're coming into a point, now there's even everything's on edge within the world. So there's no release. It's just more and more and more, and it becomes very difficult. And if we don't have the appropriate tools in place, if we don't have, the ability to bring ourselves back to center, it can be very difficult.
Yeah. Definitely. It's interesting looking at this graph, and there's all these studies coming out about this. For example, this is from an ebook, a 2022 report from Lyra Health, and it's very worth checking out. I'm happy to send that over to people if they're interested. But it made me start thinking, has mental health prior to COVID, was it just not necessarily as talked about? Was it just something that was swept under the rug more so where COVID exacerbated it?
I think so. I think
Mhm.
a lot of times it was just something we haven't talked about. And I think COVID really brought it to front that
Mm,
it's okay to talk about it. It's okay not to be okay. And I think at this point, a lot of times we understand it's okay not to be okay, but do we have the tools? Do we have the resources
right.
to fix it? And I think that's where a lot of people are now. They know they're not okay. They know it's okay not to be okay, but they don't have any solutions. And it kind of leaves a lot of people feeling helpless.
That leads me to my next point. Speaking nowadays, how well are HR supporting their hourly employees?
I think it's difficult because I
Mhm.
don't think a lot of times we know what the right thing to do is. And,
Right.
you have to be mindful with some of this stuff. If we're putting it front and center within our organizations, it makes us liable.
Mm,
So where does that liability sit? I think a lot of our organizations are still trying to figure all this out. How can they support their workforce, and how can they do it um, and keep their employees' health information safe? That's huge. We have to be very careful on how we're disclosing our health information, and are we just disclosing it to somebody sitting in HR, and now that could be realm for firing or something like that. There's a lot of moving parts of this, and I think
right.
a lot of organizations are still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm curious. With HR, comes a lot of discussion about the culture of a company, right? And the importance of culture is huge these days to draw in new hires. So, what is the impact on culture if emotional well-being is not necessarily met in the workplace?
Oh, that can totally destroy culture. I
Mm,
mean, if you have a culture where you're kind of putting your head in the sand to that, people
yeah.
aren't going to stick around. One of the biggest things, one of the top 3 that's coming with the newer age workforce is wellness.
Mm,
They don't want to be in a career that's going to make them sick, that's going to break them down. They've seen it with their parents. Maybe they were in corporate and they're just burned out, or maybe they had physical laboring jobs and their bodies are breaking down. So these generations are seeing this, and it's just like, well, I want a job that's going to support me as a person and not, break me down. So it's really important we're focusing on culture. And I think if we start creating what I like to call a wellness culture,
right.
um, I think this is where we're going to make much stronger workforces and employee relationships. And there's really easy ways to start implementing, but we need to start implementing, even on the lower level management levels.
It's interesting. I'm watching some of these responses rolling through for this poll question I asked, asking what sort of protocols or practices does your organization have in place to support the mental health of staff? And, I'm reading these through, and it's really interesting to see a lot of third party,
Mhm.
um, you know, assistant organizations are being in use. For example, a ERP and training leadership program, an EAP, a lot of EAP in here, actually, some leave of absences, the Calm app. Laura and we talked about that yesterday. I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these protocols that are just kind of coming through.
Yeah, so I love the idea of a third party app or a third
Mhm.
party organization because, like we talked before about that liability, if
Right,
you can bring in an organization that has the proper licensing, that has the proper insurance, that liability does not now sit on somebody sitting in HR. It sits at a professional's desk. And that's what we want. We want professionals in this.
right.
So I love the idea of apps. I think Headspace does a corporate
Mhm.
edition. There's so many different. I actually found, what was it called? Ginger. There is a Ginger app that's made for corporations to bring therapists in. Think that's amazing. So there's so
Wow.
many third party apps that we could start utilizing. We've seen it. Verizon last year or 2 years ago brought in Hinge Health to do
Mhm.
health coaching within their employees. So we're seeing the use of these third parties. And then, of course, bringing in an EAP program is really helpful. Um, One of the things I find that's, you know, can be somewhat difficult is a lot of mental health is very expensive,
Mhm.
even when you have a lower copay. Let's say you have, a doctor's visit is $20.
Right.
When you're dealing with mental health, and depending on wherever you are in your mental health, you might be needing to see that professional 2 times a week, maybe 3 times a week, maybe twice a month. But that $20 copay adds up really fast. You could easily be at $100 to $200 a month. And then if you have multiple people in a family, that's even more. So I think we need to do better as a society in getting better coverage when it comes to mental health. So it's more available to more people.
Definitely. That perfectly brings me to my next point. Deferring to this next slide that we have here, we talked a little bit about the impact of culture, right? Or the impact that mental well being has on culture. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the impact that it has on labor costs and overhead in general.
Yeah, there's a really cool, and I know we talked about it yesterday. There's
Mhm.
this really cool tool that was created by the National Safety Council and nationwide,
Mm,
that it is a calculator that you can enter in what state you're from, how
yep,
many employees you have, and what industry you're in, and it will tell you the cost of mental health within your industry. So for me, I just ran it real fast for someone, organization in PA with 500 employees and in retail. And it came up to like nearly a $500,000 it was costing one organization. And there's another research study that found that for every dollar that an organization spends, you get $4 back in employee retention, cost saving on health insurance, and just productivity of
yep,
those employees. So it's really powerful, but it's interesting to look at this and seeing somebody in a fair to poor mental health state. That's almost 12 missed days a year, but that's not even calculating the days that they're there. How productive are they? And I know
Mm,
within manufacturing, we were seeing so much of a loss of productivity when someone's there and then just not feeling themselves. I mean, think about it, when you're not feeling good, are you at your most productive? You're
right.
probably not.
Kim asked a great question and setting me up for success. What's the name of the calculator? Kim, I'd love to share that with you guys all right now. I just shared that calculator. You should be getting it on your screen or in the handout section. So if you would like to play around with the calculator, feel free. It is an amazing resource that Laura actually shared with me yesterday. I was like, this is an amazing tool. We got to get it to the audience. We got to get it to the masses. So feel free to use that. And yeah, I mean, getting those metrics behind HR is so important, and to connect it to the operational side of things is huge, right? To not only proving, the numbers behind invisible illness such as mental health problems, but to get the metrics on resources that you guys can use. And this is a great calculator and a great tool to be able to do so. So I really appreciate Laura for you sharing that with us. It's really beneficial. So that kind of feeds me into my next point, and we talked a little bit about this based off a study. But I would love to hear about the relationship between work loss and productivity here when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, so a lot of times when our mental health is struggling, when we're
Mhm,
looking at that productivity, a lot of times we're showing up late, we might be leaving early. And when you have an employee that's not at their best, it's contagious. If you have somebody on the floor with you and they're in a really bad mood, and they're just, whether it's depressive or it's
mhm,
anger or however it's presenting itself, that's going to affect everybody else. And there was an interesting study when I took my QRP training. They ended up finding that for any person that died by suicide, it actually has a trickle effect of 100 people. And that's really, it's mind opening for me, because the one facility that they lost somebody this year, it drastically affected everybody's production, and it wasn't just one day. It was, it's still happening now 6 months later. They're questioning, is it worth working all these hours? Is it, what's happening? There's so much going on in people's minds. So, when we start to talk about productivity,
mhm,
the effect is so wide reaching. And then, when you think about, let's say somebody leaves, they can't take it anymore, they leave. What does it cost to replace that employee? I know in corporate, usually there's a number of $100,000. Cost somebody $100,000 to replace somebody that has left an organization. And that's because it's time in training, it's
mhm.
more time in, you know, um, resources and uh, ah, thoughts totally flying away right now. And health benefits and all of this stuff. So it's not all the time, well, we'll just let them go. And I know I've heard
Right,
that from a couple people that said, oh, we'll just let them go. There's a bigger effect when we just let somebody go.
right. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And it's such a ripple effect. That's the
Hmm.
word I'm looking for, where it really does have such a huge impact. And, you know, this topic, it's very tricky to talk about in a humane way while also talking about the finances and the ROI of things, because it's so, it goes so much deeper than that, right? We're talking about lives at this point.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, it's so important to connect the dots on the numbers behind HR and to connect it back to the operational standpoint, to overhead costs, to labor costs, to ROI. Again, it's so crucial. So it's interesting to hear about this. And I'd love to go back to talking a little bit about the protocol aspect, and talking about how they looked prior to COVID, and what we are looking at there. Or was it just a very basic structure of what we're seeing now?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about kind of the protocol and what we were looking at back then, a
Mhm.
lot of times it was just your insurance company probably provided some mental health resources,
Right.
and you probably found out about them during a health fair. And
Mhm.
it was just very surface level. It was just like, yeah, we have it. Here's what it has. And there wasn't anything deeper into that. And I think now we need to go a little bit more in depth. And I know there's some, thoughts about, should we do mental health check-ins at work, and what does that look like, and how do we manage that? And I think somebody even had a question about, what do we do with the information once we have it?
Mhm.
There's so much more, but yeah, I think prior to COVID, it was very surface level. It
Yeah.
was just, this is what we have. And now, and I even know prior to COVID, when I would go into organizations, it was very much on burnout. Like, we
Mhm.
were just addressing burnout. And really, in all seriousness, that's all we really could address, you
Yeah.
know? Um, so I think now we're starting to dig a little bit deeper and really look at what we need to do. How do we be responsible as organizations?
Oh, for sure. And even looking at this first slide, going back to this, we see
Mm.
burnout in there, but it's also surrounded by anxiety, stress, depression, and we can go even deeper into those. Emotions, obviously, as we all know, are so complex. But yeah, burnout was really just the quick trigger word that would
Yep.
grab somebody's attention and everybody can say, "Yep, it's burnout." It was an umbrella fix. It was almost a Band-Aid fix, and I think we saw a lot of those Band-Aid fix approaches with the protocols that we were seeing before COVID, and COVID exacerbated that again in almost a good way to a point where we need to be. And, we've always kind of been a little bit behind the times, I feel like, when it came to mental health protocols. But now it seems we're kind of catching up. We're having conversations like these, which is amazing.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. Burnout, stress, they were just, umbrella terms, and
Mhm.
we weren't looking any deeper.
Definitely. Definitely. So I would love to hear about some of the protocols or practices that you've helped implement with HR managers at some of the companies you've worked with.
Yeah, so one of the things I really focus on is kind of an empathetic leadership end. This is
Mhm.
something that we don't need, all people to sign off on. It is something that each and every manager, each and every employee can really start doing themselves. And it's really just checking in with your employee. And I'm not saying check in and ask them, "Hey, how's your mental state?" Just check in and say, "Hey, how was your weekend? How's your week?"
Mhm.
If you know you're coming up on, a time where work is going to get a little bit, you know, difficult. Maybe you're a chocolate company and you know that you have to ramp up in July for the Christmas season,
Yeah.
checking in with their employees and saying, "Hey, how are you doing? How do you feel? Is there something we can help you with?" Just checking in. It doesn't cost anything, and it really allows us to start building a relationship with our employees, um, that I think is really helpful. And when we talk about building a wellness culture, that's really the core of it. You want to know your employer, your manager, your leader, they care about you. No one
Mhm.
wants to be the number. So when we have these conversations, it's really easy that we can kind of create a cohesive environment. So we really spend a lot of time on wellness in that level. The next
Right.
thing we want to look at is, organizations, on how are they supporting this? What can they do at an organizational level? Making sure they're taking time off. Have they created lunch times that their people can actually go to lunches? I have so many places I've worked with that, yeah, they have 30-minute lunches, but it's completely impossible for the employees to go to lunch. It's not enough time because of how it's
Mm.
all set up. So it's stuff like that that we really want to look at in the beginning.
That feeds me into going back to your certification and your
Mhm.
trainings. How does that feed into the HR protocols that you help some of these organizations build out?
Yeah, well, some of it is actually, prior to me going into health and wellness, I actually
Mhm.
worked for 15 years in corporate management and leadership. So,
Oh.
I actually worked at it was a Korean American company. And it was very interesting because when I look back at it now, they really had just this amazing culture where you were family. And granted, it was a smaller company at the time, but even when we grew and were acquired, we really kept that family feeling within the organizations as we rolled through. And I think a lot of it comes down to just caring about the employees and how they were. So a lot of that information just comes from my past management and leadership
Right.
experience. But then from the health coaching end, I know how we can better support, we can make behavioral changes, because that's, as a health coach, that is, kind of my wheelhouse, is
Mm.
being able to have people make those behavioral changes and make them stick. So between those two, that's really kind of where I live most of my time.
Yeah, I love that. It's deep rooted in psychology. I think
Mm.
that's amazing, especially organizational psychology, which is a whole other ballgame. You know, speaking of organizational aspects of things, does it range these practices from industry to industry? Is it kind of a one size fits all protocol that you tend to, help these organizations implement?
Yeah, and I love that you asked this, because it is absolutely not a one size fits all. And it was one
Right.
of the reasons why I went from corporate into focusing on shift work, because I realized what we were doing in corporate wellness did not work when we were dealing with our shift work. Now, from
Mm,
industry to industry, probably changes a little bit. What it really changes is the lifestyle of those employees. So, something I would do in a corporate environment with employees that work a Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 job, it's going to be a lot different than some organization that is a 24/7 organization, and they have rotating shift workers and things like that. And that's going to be different from what I do in a nursing setting.
yeah.
So they're going to change, but really the core of that empathetic leadership and checking in with your employees, I think it's just good human behavior.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think when it comes to creating these protocols, when it comes to creating basic HRM, HCM practices, I think starting from those basic points is absolutely key. And those cliches like treat others the way that you would want to be treated, that sort of thing. And it's hard because, and we'll talk about this a little bit, stepping over that line is sometimes really hard to know, well, not even stepping over it, but just knowing where that line is,
Mhm.
especially in today's day and age where mental health is really talked about and almost encouraged and expressed to talk about mental health the way that we're talking about it today. And it's a hard conversation because traditionally we don't necessarily think of that as a professional conversation to ask how has everything been? I know we're coming into the busy season. I just wanted to check in.
Mhm. Oh,
It's
absolutely.
yeah.
And if someone turns around and says, "You know what? Things aren't going good. I kind of feel hopeless."
Mm,
Do you know no do you know what to say? Because
yeah,
I wouldn't have known, and I would have been like, good talking to you." Like,
right.
do you know what you can do? And I think that's where the power sits, is, okay, we ask the question, but do we know what to say when the answer isn't, "Oh, yeah, everything's pretty good."
Yes, exactly. So, at the bottom line, how can HR respect and balance the professional boundaries when it comes to discussing an employee's emotional well-being?
Yeah, well, I think it's really important that, we know what resources are available to us.
Mhm.
So, one of the things I ended up finding out in 2020 is that during 2020, our insurance company, and I don't know if it was for everybody, but our insurance company waived all mental health costs.
Oh,
So, I had no copays. My kids could have seen as many office visits as they wanted, and it would have cost me nothing out of pocket. And
oh,
that
wow.
was huge for me. But when I talked to a lot of other people, they had no idea this was available. And, it was sad, and I ended up finding people would call me back. They're like, I have this too. And they didn't have to pay. So a lot of times people weren't seeking help because they didn't think they could afford it. And yet it was free.
Mm,
So that was important. And so it's really important, as HR, as any level management, you understand what resources your organization has. Do they have an application, a free app to Better Health or Headspace or Calm? You know,
mm.
what is out there. So knowing that and being able to offer that is a great solution. I also like going and getting that QRP training. I got my QRP training for free. I literally went on Eventbrite and I searched QRP training,
Oh, wow.
and it ended up being the Hope Network. They do free training sessions, and it was an hour. And it was amazing. So I could put that QRP training right in here, but it was so helpful. And it's something that you can actually have as an organization. You can have them come in and train your managers. Actually, every employee, in my eyes, should have this QRP training because it gives you the direction of how to question.
Mm. I just sent the Hope
Mhm.
Network website in the chat. Feel free to click on that. That is so beneficial. I mean, truly, that's a free training like
Yeah.
that is rooted in, mental health and how to approach future protocols and issues coming across your staff. I think that is amazing. I would love to hear about, what HR should look out for when it comes to a struggling employee, specifically pertaining to these couple bullet points we've got here from HRU Magazine.
Yeah, and I love the fact, and I said this yesterday to you, I love the fact that you have in here overly present.
Yep.
So many times we are looking at the employee that withdraws, that they're not engaged, maybe the way they dress, the way they look are changing, but we don't often look at the employee that's in the office more.
Mm,
And, early on in my career, I had a manager that all of a sudden I would be leaving the office at 9 o'clock and he would still be in the office. And one day I asked him, I said, "Isn't it time for you to go home? It's like 9 o'clock at night."
right.
And he looks at me, he goes, "Home is not where I want to be right now."
Oh my
And
God.
when I think back at it, my response to him was like, "Okay, see you tomorrow." And I
Right,
was like, "Oh
right.
my goodness, that was like the worst response ever." But it was just, here's somebody that management is probably thinking, "Oh my god, they're so dedicated to this project."
Yes.
Where no, he was suffering.
Mm,
And, I think it's really important that as managers, leaders, even, coworkers, that we're, just checking in with our coworkers. "Hey, how's it going?" If you know someone's going through a rough divorce, "Hey, how you doing today?" And just checking in. Um, so I think that's important. Can
yeah.
everyone still hear me? I just saw somebody said, "Did anyone else lose audio?"
I see that too. I'm able to still hear you. If you
Okay,
guys are
cool.
having, I'm just gonna say, try refreshing the page.
I
If you guys
don't
are
see
having
anybody.
any issues, yeah, feel
Okay,
free to
cool.
try to refresh the page, and hopefully that should do
All
the
right.
trick.
Perfect. So, checking in and being able and knowing those resources, know what's available. If
Mhm.
you are using an app yourself, I use the Calm app and I really enjoy the Calm app. So, I'll recommend people to use the Calm app. So it's, we can talk about what has worked for us.
Yes.
But then it's really about knowing if you have somebody that is telling you they've lost hope, um, they just don't feel like they can go on anymore.
Mhm.
This is when there is actually, I will give you this resource. It's really cool. And I didn't know it existed. Actually, it just started in July. So, you know how when you're in a physical emergency, you dial 911?
Mhm.
Well, if you're having a mental health crisis or you know somebody that is having a mental health crisis, you can dial 988 and it connects you with a mental health crisis expert. So I
Wow.
think that was something really powerful to learn about because a lot of times, like I was saying before, we don't know how to get somebody help.
Yes.
And even if you're not sure where they are and it just doesn't feel comfortable, still dial 988. They can connect you with local resources. They could tell you what's available around you. They
Hmm.
can give you resources to provide to them. So it empowers you to help them seek help. And I think that is really what we need to be doing.
Oh my God, that is amazing. That's such a great resource.
Yeah, and
Well,
honestly, that should be in every restroom at every company. I would love to see those 988 stickers
totally.
everywhere because I think it's so important.
Right. Yeah, right next to the wash your hands
Mhm.
poster should be the 988 poster for sure. That is so useful. How do you train managers into knowing what to look out for? I'm just curious.
For me, it's really about, that empathetic, that checking in,
Yeah.
just creating that human connection.
Mhm.
That's where my expertise is. So it's really about creating that connection.
Mhm.
And these things that you have listed here are perfect because these are just kind of guides to let us know something might not be where it needs to be. And this is great for anybody. This is great if you have children. This is great if you have friends,
Totally.
and it just helps out. And, if you're a manager and you have these connections, you're more likely to get somebody to open up to you and say, hey, listen, I'm struggling with work. I actually had a guy the other day that was telling me he had an employee. This employee was fantastic.
Mhm.
And he kind of noticed that she started coming in just a little bit like, wasn't as happy about her shifts as she was.
Mm.
And he just happened to say something. She's like, "Well, the work, it's kind of affecting just home life." So he just
Oh,
pulled her aside and he said, "Hey, listen, if I were to change your hours and give you these hours instead, would that work better for you?" And she immediately was like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't know you could do that. That would really help." So it was just a conversation like that. And if he didn't
wow.
have that conversation, he probably would have lost her.
For sure. Oh, there's no doubt about that. And just to clarify, for everybody that might not know what presenteeism is, um, this is for my own research because this was actually the first I had heard of presenteeism prior to a previous webinar that we had. But presenteeism refers to the lost productivity that occurs when employees are not fully functioning in the workplace because of an illness, injury, or other condition. So it's interesting to see the American way of doing things is very much to throw yourself into your work.
Mhm.
And we need to do better at backtracking that a little bit. And, you see a lot of this discussion about work life balance. That's another really big term that's kind of hooked its way onto burnout. And I do think that it's a really hard thing to nail down. And again, why I'm such a proponent of getting those metrics is because we need to nail down those numbers in order to prove that point in an HR perspective. But yeah, and just being able to speak to presenteeism and speak to, hey, I see you working hard, but I just wanted to make sure that everything's okay.
Yeah, and a lot of people will ask, "Well, can we poll? Can we poll the
Mhm.
employees?" And I think polling the employees is a great idea. Not all the times you get the best, outcome of it because a lot of
Right.
people won't fill them out. However, I think if you poll the employees, and I've seen this with a couple other industries that have done this, if you poll the employees with their opinions in mind, meaning like asking them, do you find that the tasks are, you know, too intensive, or do you find that you're having to work too many extra hours for a project? Things like this, putting it for them, they are more likely to respond.
Mm,
Um, Asking about management, that's a huge one. Most people, when you're asking about their managers, are going to respond if they know it's safe to do so.
definitely.
Um, but if you ask somebody, "Do you feel happy?" Yeah, they're not gonna respond to that. But if
Right.
you ask them, about burnout, ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, do you feel burned out?
Mhm.
Um, they're more likely to answer those types of questions.
Yes, definitely. That's a really great point. Um, I want to kind of conclude a little bit on everything that we've touched on. So, how can HR best implement some of the practices and protocols into their own HRM policies?
Yeah, so I think understanding what resources your employers have at their disposal.
Mm,
I think when we look at leadership training, I have been doing a little bit more with conferences, and I find these very powerful
mhm,
because a lot of times it's hard, especially in the shift or the hourly employee space, to be able to get in front of all the employees at a certain time. It's not very common to have wellness fairs and things like that. But when you have something like a conference and you can bring these experts on stage in front of your management and higher, this is where we can see a lot of that, and we could start implementing that. There's plenty of leadership training on empathy, on gratitude, things like that, and just making sure your managers know what resources are available, because they can't help their employees if they themselves don't know what resources are available. And a lot of times those resources that are available, that are great, you're paying for them, but they're buried in a Slack channel or an
Mhm.
employee website, and no one knows how to reach it. And I think it's important that those are front and center.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think, communicating those resources in a way that makes the most sense to your employees, whether it's pulling them aside one day, holding that conference, even just holding a one-on-one meeting, we've seen 30, 60, 90-day check-ins being really helpful. Anything that gets that point across and saying, this is what is available to you. This is what is available in your insurance. This is what is available on behalf of the company. You don't need to pay for this, whatever it is, communicating that to them and just letting them know that it's there, because we talked a little bit about culture, but that is really going to build up your company's culture, even just letting them know. And they're going to go home to their friends, and their friends might not have gotten the same communication. And they're going to
Mhm.
say, my company is the best. We get this and this. And that's amazing.
Absolutely.
Just having that support is amazing. It really is. Awesome. I would love to hear about, one or two top tips, actions, or takeaways the audience can do to better support their staff's mental health at the end of the day.
Yeah. So my top tip is going to be the QPR training.
Yes.
Having that training, if you're in HR, you can definitely put that as a protocol into your organization. They have enterprise level QPR training. But that's probably number one.
Mhm.
Number two is know your benefits, know what's available. And number three would be just giving somebody some space if they need to talk. Building that relationship where you could be trusted, where you can have those conversations. If work's being too difficult, or
Mhm.
maybe there's an some outside troubles and things like that. If we can have that, we can build a more cohesive community. And like what you're saying, that's really where we could start building a very strong culture.
Mm, definitely. Very well said. I would love to move on to the Q&A section of
Mhm.
this webinar. We've got some questions from earlier in the chat that I tagged. Sherry, to touch on your question, she asked, how can we help our hourly staff with stress and anxiety due to the cost of living issues, short of giving pay raises?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times sometimes people just need space to
Mm,
just let it out, to vent, so that they feel like they're being heard and not just shut down. I
yes.
think that's one of the biggest things as a leader that we can do. If stress and burnout are really kind of front and center, ask them, hey, what are some hobbies you like to do? We deal with a lot of burnout within the manufacturing industry. Now, granted, most of them are guys and most of them like to fish. So
Mhm.
fishing becomes a very, big topic we start talking about, and how we can use that for stress management. A
Yeah.
lot of people do not have a stress management routine in place. So
Mm,
it builds up, it builds up, it builds up until they're just done. And that's what we want to make sure, that they're having that outlet and talking about that. And then if you use an app or you like something, being able to refer about it. I talk a lot about the Calm app, or binaural beats is another one that I
mhm.
really like using. So if you have a resource, share it with them. If you have any experiences with a therapist that you really like, and hey, I talked to this person, they've been really helpful. Maybe, you want to give them a call and
Yeah.
things like that. I think sometimes people just need space to have that conversation.
Definitely. I think that's a great point. And again, the resources like binaural beats, I mean, the studies on those things are amazing. If you guys ever look into those, it's pretty great. We got a question from Raleigh. He or she said, thoughts on the Walmart incident. I'm not quite sure.
I think, I think are there, they're talking about the recent shooting. Um,
Oh, okay.
yeah, I mean, I don't know too much about it, and I don't wanna assume anything. I think it's horrible, and, my hearts go out to the family and the employees and everybody that's been affected by it. Um, but yeah, it's a difficult situation.
Hmm. How, approaching something like that where it's more of an external issue coming into the organization, how would you handle the staff of those Walmart employees?
Oh, I would immediately, if it was me getting involved, well, first
Mhm.
of all, I would step away because that's not my area of expertise.
Right.
But if somebody asked me what they should do, and I think they actually did do it, therapists have to be immediately on scene.
Wow.
Um,
Yes.
Offering mental health resources. I mean, just opening up the books to them and saying, "Hey, you need it. Here it is," because I can't even imagine what
Mm.
those employees, those families, anybody that was affected at any level by that. Um, that's really difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely bringing in, people who are certified in
Mhm.
therapy and, and supporting in a much deeper way.
And
And yeah.
just to add to that, one of the things that's really starting to come out is trauma and really
Mm.
having experts that are trained in trauma. We see a lot of that. I've been actually recommending a few trauma experts to certain organizations because they have a lot of armed forces and employees like that really trauma is more at the forefront. So being able to have those trauma resources, because not every health professional is trained in trauma. So making sure you have the right resources is really important.
Definitely. That's a great point. That's a really great point. We did have some questions emailed in, actually. We had a question from a Karina Yu. She said, I find it to be a lot to also play therapist to my staff. How do I know when it's a time to hand off an employee to someone more professional? How do I go about recommending this to them? And I think that second part of the question is very, very crucial.
Yeah, and that's really important because I kind of
Mhm.
get that a lot as a health coach too. Sometimes we get stuck in this therapy space and I'm not a
Right.
therapist. So, really understanding your boundaries is really important and everybody else's boundaries are a little bit different. I always give somebody space to talk about it, but when we start kind of going in that hamster wheel circle, I like to, flip that conversation around and say, "Hey, well, how are some things that we think we can implement to correct this? What do you think we can do about this? What's within your control?" To kind of get them out of that spiral. And then if it seems to go beyond that, then it's recommending, "Hey, I think you should talk to somebody," which really a lot of times, anytime I see somebody spiral, it's, "Hey, do you have somebody to talk to?"
Right.
Or something like that. So, but yeah, I know sometimes when you're a manager, somebody pops in your office and, they just kind of go off and you're like, I don't know how to get out of this. And a lot of times it's, letting them feel that there's empathy. Oh,
Mm.
that's really hard. I understand what you're going through. Or I hear you. Hey, thought about talking to somebody and flipping that around? But it's really kind of understanding your boundaries and what you're comfortable with.
Definitely, and I think that's the hardest part in all of this is,
Mhm.
saying, "Hey, I'm not sure if you had an opportunity to talk to somebody," because it makes it you don't wanna sound like, you are overstepping, and that's a big theme, I would say, of this whole webinar is, making sure that you yourself are comfortable with suggesting something that might be uncomfortable for, quite frankly, both of you in the room at the end of the day.
Oh, absolutely. And hey, if you have somebody and you know of an Instagram channel that's kind of funny and kind of lighthearted, and
Mm,
hey, have you checked out this Instagram channel? Sometimes even that, because sometimes the conversations can get pretty heavy and we need some lightheartedness. But
definitely.
yeah, I always generally sometimes usually I generally will turn it around to, an expert if it's like I said, it's not just somebody needing to vent for a second.
For sure. Adrian M emailed in a question. She asked, "What are your thoughts on regular mental health surveys or check-ins? What do I do with that information at the end of the day?"
So I'm actually not a fan of these, and I'll tell you why. And it's actually where she has her second question is, what do I do with this information?
Hmm.
If you have this information, you are held liable.
Right.
So if you're going to do mental health surveys, please talk to a corporate lawyer and see, is this okay? Where's the liability standpoint? I like using a third party resource.
Mm.
Um, and trying to gain that. However, just having a conversation with somebody is totally okay. But I think a lot of times when we try to formalize it, that's where we can get ourselves into some legal trouble. And especially if, you have these surveys and somebody wrote something down, then we have to be careful with HIPAA laws and things like that. So we got to be
No
careful with what information that we're currently holding and where we're holding it.